In 1943, on a muddy field somewhere in occupied Europe, German engineers stood around a strange, clunky weapon they could barely take seriously. It was British, it was ugly, and it looked more like a plumbing pipe than a weapon of war. The men of the Wehrmacht called it a joke, the spring cannon, a crude toy made by desperate enemies. But within hours that laughter would stop, because the weapon they mocked, the British PIAT, would do what even German technology feared most. It would destroy a tank. The PIAT, short for Projector, Infantry, Anti-Tank, was Britain's answer to the growing menace of German armor. When it first appeared on the battlefield, even Allied soldiers weren't sure what to make of it. It was heavy, awkward, and painfully difficult to fire. But behind its crude looks hid something revolutionary, a simple, spring-powered launcher that could fire a shape-charged bomb capable of piercing even the thick armor of a panzer. To the Germans, this strange contraption was the result of British improvisation, a desperate attempt to replace the effective American bazooka. They didn't know yet that the PIAT was far more powerful than it appeared. When German intelligence units captured their first PIATs from British paratroopers in North Africa and later in Sicily, they sent them back to the weapons testing grounds at Kummersdorf. There, teams of engineers and officers gathered to study the new weapon. They laughed when they first saw it. A tube with a spring inside, a handle, and a clumsy trigger. "This is not a weapon," one officer reportedly said. "This is a child's toy." But when they opened the weapon and studied its internals, confusion replaced arrogance. There was no rocket motor, no propellant like in their own Panzerfaust or the American bazooka. Instead, it used a massive spring to hurl a bomb, a shaped charge with deadly precision. To the German engineers, it seemed primitive, even absurd. They noted its flaws immediately: the heavy recoil, the awkward loading process, the enormous effort required to cock it. But what intrigued them most was the bomb itself. Inside its simple shell was a shaped explosive designed to focus its blast into a single, armor-piercing jet. They decided to test it. A captured Panzer III was rolled onto the range. The engineers stood back, amused but curious. A test officer crouched, aimed, and fired. The PIAT jolted backward with a sharp metallic snap. The bomb flew straight, slow, almost lazy, before striking the side of the tank. Then, to everyone's shock, there was a flash, and the steel plate of the Panzer's hull split open as if torn by invisible hands. Smoke and flame burst from the impact point. The shell had punched through armor that most small arms couldn't scratch. The laughter stopped. The officers stared at the smoking wreck in disbelief. A weapon they had dismissed as crude had just achieved something their most advanced infantry guns struggled to do: destroy a tank with a single shot. From that moment on, the PIAT was no longer a joke. It became a mystery that demanded understanding. The engineers began to dissect the weapon again, this time with reverence. They realized that the British had built something fundamentally different. Not elegant, not high-tech, but brutally efficient. A weapon designed for soldiers in trenches, for men who needed to kill tanks up close without relying on fuel, rockets, or complicated parts. And as they tested it again, one of the German analysts reportedly muttered, almost to himself, "This is not a toy. This is genius born from desperation." In that moment, the PIAT earned its place in history, not as a perfect weapon, but as one that turned simplicity into strength. It embodied the British philosophy of wartime invention: crude, awkward, but unstoppable when it mattered most. Yet for the Germans, it was more than an engineering puzzle. It was a warning, a glimpse of how their enemies thought, how they fought, and how far they were willing to go to stop a tank. The tests were only beginning, and soon they would discover just how much destruction that strange little spring-powered launcher could unleash. The smoke still hung in the air as the German engineers gathered around the wreck of the Panzer III. The hole punched through its armor was small, clean, and terrifyingly precise. The test team ran their hands across the melted edges of the steel. It wasn't shattered or torn. It was liquefied. The explosive jet from the PIAT's warhead had cut through it like a blowtorch. The shaped charge, known in German as a Hohlladung, was not a new idea. In fact, German scientists had pioneered much of its early development, but what astonished them was how effectively the British had adapted it into such a crude-looking weapon. The PYAT was heavy, clumsy, and awkward to use, yet it could fire a projectile that rivaled their best anti-tank rifles and rocket weapons. At the Kummersdorf Proving Ground, the engineers conducted more tests. They set up plates of steel at varying thicknesses, 50 millimeters, 75 millimeters, 100 millimeters. Each time the PIAT's shaped charge pierced through, often creating small entry holes and devastating internal spall. The test officers took notes, their tone shifting from mockery to admiration. One German observer wrote, "It is primitive but effective." The English have used the principle of simplicity to great success. In the Luftwaffe's research division and the Heereswaffenamt, the Army Weapons Office, reports about the captured PIAT began circulating. Its power impressed even the most skeptical officers, but they couldn't understand one thing: why rely on a spring? To them, a spring-powered launcher seemed ancient in concept, something fit for the 19th century, not the mechanized warfare of 1943. Then one engineer, studying the weapon's design, pointed out its greatest secret: independence. The PIAT needed no propellant, no cartridges, no explosive fuel. It could be built, fired, and reloaded with nothing more than mechanical force. That meant it could be produced in huge quantities under siege conditions with minimal resources. For a nation like Britain, fighting across oceans under bombardment and rationed of fuel, this was genius. Soon, German technicians began their own firing trials. They replicated the spring mechanism, measuring the force needed to cock the launcher. The first soldier who tried it struggled, pulling the weapon upright with all his strength. The engineers laughed again, but only briefly. They realized that, once loaded, it fired cleanly. The bomb flew in a flat arc, accurate up to 100 yards and capable of destroying even medium armor. One officer noted in his logbook, "It is difficult to use, but in the hands of a strong man, deadly." German tank crews began to report encounters with the weapon in the field. From Tunisia to Normandy, the stories were the same. British soldiers appearing out of nowhere, firing what looked like a metal pipe, and tanks suddenly erupting in fire. The men who once dismissed the PIAT as a clumsy tool now feared it. By 1944, even Hitler's own weapons experts had copies of the captured PIATs. They disassembled the projectiles and discovered the effectiveness of the British fusing system. Unlike most German designs which used contact detonators, the PIAT's fuse triggered instantly upon impact, maximizing the shaped charge's effect. The Germans realized that the weapon's simplicity was its armor. There were no delicate parts to jam, no propellant to misfire. It was the kind of weapon that could be dropped in mud, frozen, soaked in rain, and still fire. They began adapting lessons from the PIAT into their own systems, improving reliability and ease of use in weapons like the Panzerfaust and Panzerschreck. One German weapons designer reportedly told a colleague, "It is British, but it could have been ours." But what struck the German engineers most was not the weapon's technical details. It was its philosophy. The British had built the PYAT not for elegance, but for survival. It was designed for soldiers fighting in ruins, hedgerows, and trenches, men who might get only one shot at saving themselves. And that was where the real power of the PIAT lay. It wasn't just an anti-tank weapon. It was a symbol of defiance, of improvisation and determination in the face of overwhelming odds. As the test continued, the laughter never returned. The engineers now spoke of the weapon with a mixture of respect and caution. It had proven that even a spring and a shaped charge in the right hands could destroy a symbol of German superiority, the Panzer. But what they didn't yet know was that the PYAT's legend had only just begun. On the battlefields of Europe, it would earn a reputation not only for power, but for heroism. By the summer of 1943, the PIAT had moved from secret prototype to battlefield reality, and the Germans were learning about it the hard way. Reports came in from Tunisia first, then from Sicily, and finally from the Italian mainland. Everywhere British and Commonwealth troops went, so did this strange spring-powered weapon that could turn a man into a tank killer. At first, the German tank crews refused to believe what they were seeing. They thought British infantry had hidden artillery guns or anti-tank mines. The idea that a single soldier could destroy a panzer with a shoulder-fired launcher seemed absurd. Yet after each battle, wrecks of tanks showed the same telltale sign: a small hole in the armor and the inside charred by molten metal. The Wehrmacht's technical division began to gather field reports. They described the weapon as short-range, highly effective, and difficult to detect. One officer noted grimly, "Our armor no longer guarantees survival. The enemy now carries death in his hands." In London, the British War Office considered the PIAT an ungainly compromise. But in the field, it was a lifeline. It required no propellant cartridges, made little smoke when fired, and could be used from windows, trenches, or even basements without fear of backblast. The British soldiers quickly learned to love it. German engineers, however, were fascinated by how such an awkward weapon could work so efficiently. At the Kummersdorf testing ground, the PIAT was tested alongside captured Panzerfaust and Panzerschreck prototypes. The results shocked even the designers. At close range, the PIAT's shaped charge could penetrate over 100 millimeters of armor, making it lethal against nearly every German tank of the early war. One engineer reportedly said, "It looks like a toy, but it kills like a cannon." The secret was the warhead's design. The shaped charge, or HEAT, high explosive anti-tank, focused the explosive energy into a jet of molten copper capable of slicing through steel. The Germans had similar technology, but their early infantry weapons required rocket propulsion, a complicated and expensive system that left soldiers exposed to backblast. The PIAT avoided all of that. It used a massive spring to launch the bomb forward and a small propellant charge inside the projectile to ignite the shaped charge upon impact. Simple, direct, deadly. When German engineers analyzed the weapon, they were both impressed and disturbed. They admired its ingenuity, but were unsettled by its message: that the Allies could produce effective weapons with almost primitive materials. While German industry was pushing for complexity, guided missiles, advanced optics, jet propulsion, the British had built a weapon that any factory could produce by the thousands. A report from the Heereswaffenamt in late 1943 concluded, "The English have built a weapon for total war, efficient, economical, and universal." On the front lines, the PIAT was already rewriting the rules of combat. In the ruins of Italian villages, in the hedgerows of Normandy, British and Canadian troops learned to stalk tanks like hunters. They waited in silence until the panzers were close, then fired from just 30 or 40 meters away. It was risky, it was terrifying, but it worked. One German tank commander later recalled, "You could see them in the smoke, just a shadow, a flash, and then fire inside your own tank." It was madness. Back in Germany, as the test results continued, some engineers began to wonder what would happen if they combined the simplicity of the PIAT with the power of their own Panzerfaust. Could they make a weapon that was both mass-producible and powerful? The result of that thinking would influence the evolution of German infantry weapons in the final years of the war. But even before that, they had to admit, the British had achieved something remarkable. To the Germans, the PIAT was an enigma. It broke every design rule they had believed in. It was ugly, crude, difficult to load, yet perfectly suited for war. It embodied a kind of efficiency that Germany's over-engineered weapons often lacked. And as the test concluded, one engineer summed up the lesson in his report: "The English build weapons for soldiers. We build them for engineers. That is why they succeed." The laughter that had once filled the testing grounds had long since faded. Now there was only the cold respect of men who understood what they were up against, and the realization that even the most unlikely weapon could change the course of battle. By the winter of 1943, word of the PIAT had reached every level of the German military hierarchy. From the Eastern Front to the command halls of Berlin, it was no longer dismissed as a British curiosity. The reports were clear. This weapon, crude though it appeared, was destroying panzers, bunkers, and armored vehicles with terrifying reliability. In the testing grounds of Kummersdorf and Hillersleben, The German engineers ran dozens of trials with the captured PIATs. They fired at plates of Panther and Tiger armor. They dismantled the internal mechanism, sketched its spring system, and studied its warhead. To their disbelief, it performed consistently. The spring-powered launcher, though heavy and difficult to cock, delivered enough velocity to activate the shaped charge perfectly every time. The engineers noted that while it lacked elegance, it was astonishingly dependable, even when covered in mud, frozen, or damaged. One report concluded simply, "It will function when ours will not." This revelation troubled the German engineers. For years, the Reich's design philosophy had been rooted in precision, advanced optics, complex mechanisms, and fine tolerances. But now they were confronted with a weapon that defied that logic. It was the opposite of their ideals: rough, industrial, brutally efficient. In one memo, a Luftwaffe observer wrote, "The English have built something the factory worker understands. It is not a weapon of pride, but of necessity," and that was exactly the point. The PIAT had been created for a nation fighting for survival. Britain, stretched thin by war, could not afford luxury in design. They needed weapons that could be built cheaply, repaired easily, and used by anyone. The Germans, in contrast, were trapped by their own brilliance. Their weapons were masterpieces, but masterpieces required time, skill, and resources. Every new tank, gun, and aircraft demanded the precision of experts and the rarest of materials. The Allies were fighting an industrial war. Germany was fighting a craftsman's war, and losing. When word reached the Eastern Front that the Soviets had begun capturing PYATs and copying their ammunition, alarm spread through the German ranks. The weapon had become a symbol of Allied ingenuity, a reminder that even nations under siege could outthink a superpower built on engineering pride. At the same time, the German Weapons Bureau was developing the Panzerfaust and Panzerschreck, both more powerful than the PIAT, but neither as forgiving. The Panzerfaust was cheap, single-use, and deadly at short range, while the Panzerschreck offered longer range but came with the dangerous backblast that could reveal a soldier's position. The PIAT sat perfectly between them, reusable, quiet, and devastating. In captured British manuals translated into German, one line stood out to the engineers: "The PIAT's purpose is to give every soldier the power to resist armor." That simple idea, decentralizing power from tanks to infantry, struck a deep chord. The Germans had relied on armored dominance since the Blitzkrieg, but now even their best tanks were being stalked by men with portable launchers. The battlefield balance was shifting. One officer remarked, "It is as if the infantryman has declared war on steel itself." The German engineers continued to dissect and test the weapon. They tried adapting its firing spring, altering the bomb's design, and comparing it to their own models. They respected its practicality but struggled with its philosophy. To them, the PIAT wasn't simply a weapon. It was an industrial statement. It proved that victory didn't belong to those with the most advanced technology, but to those who could produce what was good enough in massive numbers under any conditions. As 1944 approached, German production lines were collapsing under Allied bombing. Raw materials were dwindling. Skilled labor was scarce. And yet the British and Americans kept flooding the battlefield with new weapons, tanks, and aircraft, each one simpler, sturdier, faster to build. The engineers understood then what the generals would not. Germany's war wasn't being lost on the front lines. It was being lost in the factories. The PIAT became a symbol of that realization. A crude weapon that embodied everything Germany could not replicate quickly enough. It was ugly, yes, but it worked. And in war, that was all that mattered. As one engineer wrote in his final report, "We built perfection. They built persistence. In the end, persistence wins." By the spring of 1944, the British PIAT had earned a reputation across every major front. It was a weapon of the soldier, not the engineer. Heavy, awkward, and brutally effective. And when the Germans tested it against their most formidable machines, the Panther, the Tiger, and the Elephant, they could no longer laugh. At the Kummersdorf Proving Grounds, a captured PIAT was set up before a line of steel plates mimicking tank armor. Engineers and officers watched as a single British bomb, fired from what looked like an oversized spring tube, slammed into the plate. The explosion was brief, but when the smoke cleared, silence followed. The plate had been pierced clean through. What the Germans saw that day was not brute force, but brilliance in chemistry. The PIAT's warhead used a shaped charge, a focus jet of molten metal formed by the explosion, capable of burning through inches of armor. It wasn't the size of the blast that mattered. It was the precision. One officer whispered, "They've turned mathematics into a weapon." The Germans were no strangers to shaped charges. They had experimented with them for years. But their delivery systems, complex rocket tubes and heavy launchers, were impractical for mass use. The PIAT, by contrast, achieved the same results with nothing but a spring and a trigger. It was absurdly simple, almost insulting in its elegance. In one report, a German weapons engineer wrote, "An English farmer could build this in his barn, and yet it defeats our tanks." That statement captured the essence of what troubled them most. The weapon represented a kind of military democracy. Anyone, anywhere could wield it. It didn't require elite training or industrial perfection. It only required courage and a steady hand. As the Allied invasion of Europe drew closer, German intelligence began intercepting more reports of PYAT use in Italy and Normandy. In the narrow streets of towns like Cassino and Anzio, British infantry used it to ambush tanks at close range. Panthers and Stugs that had once been unstoppable found themselves burning from a single well-placed shot. German soldiers came to fear the squat, black tube more than they feared artillery. It struck from alleys, from windows, from hedgerows. The very terrain became a trap. The engineers in Berlin began studying how to counter it. They tested skirt armor, Schürzen, and spaced plating to deflect the blast. These defenses helped, but only for a time. The PIAT's penetration power was too great, and its simplicity made it unstoppable. Unlike the Panzerschreck, which produced a visible backblast, the PIAT fired silently and left no trail. German tank crews could not tell where the shot had come from until it was too late. One Panzer commander later wrote, "It was like being hunted by ghosts. You never heard it. You only saw the fire." Meanwhile, at the German testing facilities, engineers tried to replicate the design. They admired the spring-driven system but struggled with its sheer brute strength. The mainspring required immense force to cock, nearly impossible for smaller soldiers. They noted this flaw but also recognized its advantage. It needed no external propellant, no rocket fuel, no powder that could misfire in cold or rain. It was a self-contained, self-powered weapon, immune to the chaos of war. One engineer summed it up bluntly. "This is not the weapon of a superpower. This is the weapon of a survivor," and that realization cut deep. By 1944, the German war machine was no longer the unstoppable force it had been. Allied bombers darkened the skies, factories lay in ruins, and supply lines were breaking. The engineers who studied the PIAT began to see it as more than a tool. It was a metaphor for the Allied war effort itself. Crude but functional, imperfect but relentless. The Germans built for superiority, the Allies built for survival, and survival was winning. As the Allies pushed inland from Normandy, German officers sent frantic reports back to Berlin. They spoke of ambushes where tanks were destroyed by infantry lying in wait with handheld launchers. They could not always identify the weapon. Sometimes it was a PIAT, sometimes an American bazooka, but the result was always the same. Armor could no longer dominate the battlefield alone. One German report, written in August 1944, declared, "The enemy has found a way to make every soldier a tank killer." For the German engineers who once mocked the PYAT as a crude toy, this was the final humiliation. They had underestimated not just the weapon, but the mindset behind it. The belief that practicality beats perfection, and that in war, simplicity saves lives. And as the ruins of Europe burned under Allied bombs, they realized something far more devastating. It wasn't the most advanced weapons that won the war. It was the ones that worked. By the late summer of 1944, German engineers had stopped laughing at the PIAT. What had once seemed like a primitive, almost laughable contraption had proven itself again and again in battle, from the rubble of Cassino to the hedgerows of Normandy. It was the ultimate symbol of Allied pragmatism, a weapon that defied elegance, but never failed its purpose. At first, the German High Command believed reports of the PIAT's effectiveness were exaggerated. But by August, the evidence was impossible to deny. Tank recovery teams across France sent back disturbing images: burned-out panzers with small, precise holes punched cleanly through their armor. Each hole told the same story: a shaped charge fired from the shadows. At one field workshop near Falaise, an engineer ran his fingers over the blackened steel of a destroyed Panther tank. The entry wound was no larger than a fist. Inside, everything was gone. He muttered quietly, This, this was no shell, it was a knife." The Germans had long prided themselves on technological superiority, on the craftsmanship of their weapons, the precision of their machinery. But the PIAT represented something entirely different. A weapon designed not for beauty or perfection, but for necessity. It embodied the spirit of total war, cheap to make, easy to repair, and deadly in its simplicity. When German scientists at Kummersdorf disassembled a captured PIAT for detailed analysis, they found themselves both puzzled and impressed. There were no delicate moving parts, no fragile circuits, no reliance on fine tolerances. Everything about it screamed function over form. One engineer wrote in his report, "This weapon insults the engineer's ego, and yet it accomplishes what we cannot." The more they tested it, the clearer the truth became. The PIAT didn't just work. It changed how infantry fought tanks. It allowed soldiers with no artillery, no vehicles, and no air cover to challenge steel monsters that once ruled the battlefield. The German army had spent years perfecting its armored warfare. The Blitzkrieg, the armored spearhead, the thunder of panzers rolling across Europe. But now a single soldier with a tube and a spring could stop them. The irony was bitter. By September 1944, captured PIATs were being tested alongside German weapons like the Panzerfaust and Panzerschreck. The engineers admired its self-contained firing system. No dangerous backblasts, no signature flash. Soldiers could fire it from windows, trenches, even buildings without fear of setting themselves on fire. The Panzerfaust, though powerful, was disposable. A single shot and it was gone. The PIAT could be reloaded, reused, and carried into battle again and again. In one comparative test, a PIAT team hit a stationary Tiger tank from 80 meters. The shaped charge pierced its side armor clean through. Watching from behind safety glass, a German officer shook his head and said simply, "This is a soldier's gun." But there was one thing that impressed the Germans even more than its lethality: its psychological impact. Reports from the front described tank crews abandoning vehicles after a single PIAT hit, even when the armor held. The fear of the unseen threat, of that silent, spring-fired weapon hidden in the ruins, was enough to break morale. Tank warfare had always relied on dominance and intimidation. The PIAT stripped that away. German officers began recommending that their troops recover and use captured PIATs whenever possible. By 1945, the Wehrmacht had even issued translated manuals for limited field use. They couldn't produce it in numbers, but they respected it enough to wield it. It was an extraordinary reversal. A weapon once dismissed as laughably crude had become an object of admiration, even envy. One Wehrmacht report noted, "It is not beautiful, it is not advanced, but it is perfect in its simplicity." In the chaos of the war's final months, captured PIATs appeared in the hands of desperate defenders. From Italy to the Eastern Front, the Germans had no illusions left about its power. It was not the weapon of an industrial giant, nor the invention of a genius. It was something greater, the product of necessity. It symbolized a truth that no amount of propaganda could deny: that resourcefulness could rival even the most advanced technology. As one German engineer wrote in his final wartime report, "The PIAT is the most infuriating weapon we have ever encountered. Because it works, we laughed at it. Then we feared it, and now we respect it. He ended with a single haunting line. It proves that even the simplest idea, when born from desperation, can destroy empires. By early 1945, Germany's war machine was collapsing, and with it, the illusion of technological supremacy. The great armored divisions that had once thundered across Europe were now scattered, their tanks burning on roads lined with refugees and snow. Yet amid this ruin, German engineers continued their work, testing, comparing, documenting, trying to understand how the Allies had turned crude designs into devastatingly effective weapons. At Kummersdorf and Hillersleben, captured Allied weapons filled the testing grounds. American bazookas, Soviet PTRDs, and British PIATs. The engineers had studied them all, but there was something about the PIAT that still fascinated them. A weapon so utterly un-German in its philosophy, yet perfectly suited to the realities of modern war. To the Germans, weapons were machines. Precise, refined, calibrated. The PIAT was the opposite. It was brutal in design, relying on brute force and mechanical simplicity. But where the Germans saw complexity as strength, the British had found power in minimalism. Engineers began running field tests under controlled conditions, firing captured PIATs at abandoned tanks. Each test reinforced what frontline troops already knew. The weapons-shaped charge was terrifyingly efficient. Against medium armor, it was nearly always lethal. Against heavier tanks like the Tiger or Panther, it could cripple tracks, damage suspension, or knock out optics, rendering them useless. One engineer recorded in his log, "It does not destroy with fire or impact. It destroys by piercing the heart of the machine." The reports grew increasingly sober. The laughter that had greeted the PIAT's capture 2 years earlier was gone. In its place was reluctant admiration, even respect. What disturbed the Germans most wasn't the weapon's power, but how quickly and cheaply it could be made. The Reich was running out of everything: steel, fuel, rubber, manpower. The Allies, however, were producing weapons like the PYAT in staggering numbers. They didn't need to rely on specialized factories or scarce materials. The PIAT could be assembled in small workshops, transported in crates, repaired with basic tools. It was a soldier's weapon, not a nation's trophy. One German officer wrote in frustration, "While we build masterpieces, they build victories." By this point, German engineers had tested dozens of captured PIATs. They found that despite crude manufacturing marks, each one functioned the same. There were no inconsistencies, no defective batches, no alignment issues. Proof of an industrial process the Germans could no longer match. They admired the magnetic simplicity of its firing mechanism, a spring-driven spigot that launched the bomb without using traditional propellant. It meant no backblast, no smoke signature, no recoil that could reveal the shooter's position. For tank crews used to hunting threats by sight and sound, this made the PIAT a nightmare. Reports from the field painted a grim picture. In Italy, Panthers had been ambushed in tight alleys by single infantrymen armed only with a PIAT. In Normandy, soldiers used them from hedgerows to hit the sides of Tigers where armor was thinner. In Arnhem, paratroopers had even disabled German armor while cut off and surrounded. The PIAT had given them a fighting chance. To the Germans, this was the worst kind of innovation. Not elegant, but effective. One report from a test officer summed it up simply: "It is the weapon of a soldier who refuses to lose." He wasn't wrong. The PIAT had become more than a piece of equipment. It was a symbol of Allied resolve. The idea that resourcefulness could defeat refinement, that simplicity could triumph over sophistication. And as the Reich's own engineers watched the last of their tanks burn on the eastern and western fronts, they began to understand what that meant. By April 1945, with the war nearly lost, the remaining weapons researchers were ordered to archive their data. The notes on the PIAT were kept, not as mockery, but as a lesson. A captured British weapon, once dismissed as crude, had forced the German military to confront an uncomfortable truth: that perfection was not the same as effectiveness. One engineer scribbled a final remark at the bottom of his report before fleeing the facility. The enemy wins not by building the best weapon, but by building enough of them, and by ensuring every man can use it. By the spring of 1945, the war was nearly over, but in the hidden laboratories of the Reich, the tests continued. The engineers at Kummersdorf and Hillersleben, now surrounded by the chaos of collapsing front lines, still worked through the night. They were measuring, documenting, and comparing, desperate to preserve some fragment of their once proud military science. And among their last projects sat a weapon they had once laughed at, the British PIAT. The irony was heavy. 2 years earlier, the same engineers had dismissed the PIAT as a clumsy toy, an embarrassment compared to Germany's elegant Panzerfaust and Panzerschreck. Now, as the Allies closed in, they saw it differently. The PIAT was a window into a philosophy that had defeated them, one of adaptability, mass production, and practicality over perfection. In their notes, the engineers described it not as a marvel of technology, but as a masterpiece of logic. No expensive metals, no exotic fuels, no reliance on factories that could be bombed, just a spring, a spigot, and a shaped charge powerful enough to destroy the most advanced tank in the world. At one test range outside Berlin, engineers fired the captured PIATs against decommissioned armor plates salvaged from damaged Panthers and Tigers. The results stunned them again. At 100 meters, the shaped charge punched through 75 millimeters of hardened steel. At closer range, it breached even thicker armor. One observer wrote, "The shaped charge jet burns like a lance. The steel doesn't shatter, it melts and folds." These tests confirmed what German tank crews had already learned the hard way on the front lines. The PIAT, in the hands of a determined soldier, could stop even the most feared machine of the Reich. The engineers realized the weapon's strength wasn't just in its penetration, but in its independence. It didn't rely on batteries, explosives, or volatile propellants. A soldier could carry it through mud, rain, or rubble, and it would still work. No smoke trail, no flash, no sound to betray the shooter. It was a weapon made for survival, and survival by 1945 was all the German army could think about. Some engineers began comparing the PYAT's practicality to Germany's own weapons philosophy. The Panzerschreck was powerful but unwieldy. Its backblast revealed the firer's position instantly. The Panzerfaust was simple and deadly, but single-use, requiring constant resupply. The PIAT combined both qualities, reusable, powerful, and invisible in the field. One test officer wrote bitterly, "It is not elegant, but neither is defeat." The more they studied it, the more they respected it. They realized that the weapon represented something larger than its steel and springs. It was a symbol of how the Allies fought. The British didn't build weapons for prestige or propaganda. They built tools to win wars, and that was what made them dangerous. In the final reports, the engineers detailed how the PIAT had influenced German infantry tactics without them even realizing it. German units began adapting their training to expect such weapons, to use cover differently, to angle armor, to change formations in urban fighting. Even in its simplicity, the PIAT was reshaping the battlefield. One colonel reviewing the report commented, "The enemy's genius lies not in invention, but in understanding necessity." As the war neared its end, Allied forces were closing in on the very testing sites where the PIAT had been studied. Engineers began burning documents, destroying prototypes, and erasing evidence. But one report, written by a senior weapons analyst, survived. In his closing paragraph, he wrote, "The British PIAT is a strange weapon. Crude, heavy, unrefined. Yet it embodies everything we failed to achieve. Strength through simplicity and victory through practicality." It was perhaps the last honest statement written in a collapsing empire. When the Allies entered the testing grounds weeks later, they found the remains of the PIAT tests. Shattered armor, burned-out tanks, and notebooks full of reluctant admiration. And though the engineers who studied it were gone, their words remained. Silent witnesses to a weapon they had once mocked, and a lesson they had learned too late. The Germans had laughed at the PIAT, but by the end the laughter had died, replaced by something far more enduring: respect. By the time the war's final months arrived, the British PIAT had already made its mark across Europe. It wasn't a glamorous weapon. There were no victory parades for the man who carried it. But wherever German armor rolled forward, the PIAT followed, through hedgerows, ruins, and city streets. And in those streets, it earned the respect of even its enemies. In early 1945, German officers on the Western Front began reporting something they had never expected. Tank units were hesitating to advance in urban areas, even when outnumbering the defenders. The reason was simple. The PIAT, British and Canadian infantrymen, wielded the weapon from windows, cellars, and alleyways, turning narrow streets into killing zones. One German panzer commander later wrote, "We could not see them. There was no flash, no smoke, no warning, and then suddenly the tank was burning." That unseen terror, the silent arc of a PIAT bomb, began to shape how German armor moved. Entire tactics had to change to counter a weapon they had once dismissed. Back in Germany, the engineers continued their evaluations, even as Allied troops approached. What struck them most wasn't just the PIAT's lethality, but its accessibility. It could be built quickly, assembled with minimal training, and maintained in the field with almost no tools. In one report found after the war, a German weapons officer admitted, "The British have achieved what we sought in vain, a perfect balance between technology and simplicity." He noted that where the Germans had produced dozens of complex anti-tank systems, each more advanced, each more difficult to maintain, the Allies had focused on one that worked everywhere. The engineers even experimented with modifying captured PIATs. They tested new projectiles, improved trigger mechanisms, and attempted to lighten the heavy spring that had initially drawn ridicule. But they realized that every modification undermined its defining trait: rugged reliability. The weapon didn't need refinement. It needed men who trusted it. And that was where the Germans saw the true genius of the design. It gave ordinary soldiers the power to destroy something extraordinary. As Allied forces pushed deeper into Germany, stories circulated among captured German officers. Many admitted that their tank crews had grown to fear the PIAT almost as much as air attacks. Not because it was unstoppable, but because it could come from anywhere. A tank commander captured near Arnhem confessed during interrogation, "We thought of it as a crude toy, but when it strikes, it is like thunder from a cellar." That description, half in awe, half in disbelief, captured what the engineers already knew. The PIAT represented the kind of war Germany had failed to prepare for: decentralized, adaptive, built on human ingenuity rather than technological arrogance. After the war, when Allied intelligence teams examined German archives, they discovered detailed reports about the PIAT. Many included praise, reluctantly written but sincere. One document from a captured weapons institute read, "It is crude, but it works. It does not rely on factories, but on men. That is its genius." Those words stood as quiet recognition that Germany's downfall had not come from inferior weapons, but from misplaced faith. The belief that sophistication alone could win wars. The British, with their simple steel tube and a spring the size of a man's arm, had proven otherwise. The engineers who had once mocked the weapon were among the last to leave their posts as Germany surrendered. Some were captured by Allied forces, others disappeared into the ruins of their cities. But wherever they ended up, one truth followed them. The British PIAT had left its mark not just on their tanks, but on their pride. One engineer, interviewed years later, summed up the lesson in a single line: "In war, it is not the prettiest weapon that wins. It is the one that refuses to fail." The PIAT was never elegant. It kicked hard, weighed too much, and often bruised the shoulder of whoever dared to fire it. But it was a weapon born from necessity, and necessity, as the Germans learned, is the most powerful force of all. As the war drew to its final, smoldering end, even the engineers who had once laughed at it could not deny what it represented: a tool of endurance, built by a nation that refused to break. When the war finally ended in 1945, the world was left to sort through the wreckage, not just of cities and armies, but of ideas. The German engineers, once the pride of Europe, found themselves humbled. They had built the fastest, the strongest, the most advanced machines of war, and yet they had been defeated by nations that valued function over perfection. In British and American archives, Allied intelligence officers found something remarkable. Captured German reports on the PIAT. They were detailed, precise, and respectful. The same engineers who once laughed at the weapon now praised it in technical evaluations. One report from a Wehrmacht testing facility read, "This is not a refined design, but it fulfills its purpose completely. It requires no fuel, no compressed gas, and no complex manufacturing. It gives every infantryman the means to fight a tank." That was the kind of praise the British weapon designers never expected. Validation from their most formidable enemy. After the surrender, British and American forces invited captured German engineers to inspect Allied weapon stockpiles. When they handled the PIAT once more, they no longer saw it as crude or primitive. They saw it as a symbol of something they themselves had forgotten: practicality. One Luftwaffe engineer admitted during an interrogation, "We had over-engineered everything: aircraft, tanks, even rifles. We thought complexity meant superiority. The British proved us wrong." That single sentence summed up the entire technological divide between the Axis and the Allies. While Germany designed machines that demanded perfection, the Allies built weapons that could endure imperfection and still win. The PYAT had proven itself across every front, from the deserts of North Africa to the hedgerows of Normandy and the ruins of Arnhem. It destroyed tanks, silenced pillboxes, and gave ordinary infantry the courage to stand their ground. But its greatest victory was not measured in destroyed armor. It was in the respect it earned. When even the enemy engineers who had mocked it came to admire it, the weapon's legacy was sealed. In the post-war years, many nations studied the PYAT's design. Its principles inspired future generations of infantry anti-tank weapons, from the French LRAC to the British LAW. But its most direct descendant would come from the country that once feared it: Germany. The Panzerfaust, their famous disposable launcher, had shared a similar philosophy: simple, cheap, and deadly. After the war, the idea of empowering the common soldier with portable anti-armor firepower became universal. The PIAT had not just changed battles, it had changed doctrine. As the engineers packed away their files and returned to what was left of their homeland, some could not help but reflect on what the war had taught them. Power alone was not enough. Precision alone was not enough. Survival came from adaptability and humility. In a world rebuilt from ruin, that lesson endured far longer than any weapon. Years later, in interviews conducted by Allied historians, several former German engineers admitted that the PIAT had changed their view of warfare. One of them said simply, "We thought strength came from perfection. But true strength comes from simplicity, from understanding what must work no matter what." That perhaps was the real genius of the PIAT. It wasn't just a weapon, it was a reminder of what war reveals about human ingenuity. In the end, the British PIAT stood as a symbol of the war's most unexpected truth: that brilliance does not always win battles. Sometimes what wins is persistence, creativity, and the will to keep fighting with whatever tools one has. The Germans had laughed when they first tested it, but when their tanks burned and their engineers wrote reports in admiration, the laughter was gone, replaced by silence and respect. The PIAT was never beautiful, it was never elegant, but it worked, and that was enough to change history. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more World War II stories.